her dogs, gardens, and husbands, writing, writing, writing. But above all, she bathed in the love of the millions of children who devoured her books and clamoured for her attention, and came to her readings, and joined her clubs, and pursued her with gifts and letters, and visited her at Green Hedges, the large mock Tudor home she named and nurtured in Beaconsfield. Although we still have to ask, where did that leave her own two daughters? Enid Blyton adored Swanage. Once she discovered the place in the spring of 1931, on a day trip from Bournemouth, where she was holidaying with Hugh Pollock, her first husband, and pregnant with her first child, Gillian, she came again and again, often 3 times a year, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. On that first trip, as she told the dear boys and girls in a letter to Teacher's World, she came soaring over the hills on the road from Wareham, driving her little car, and saw the ruin of an old castle on a rounded hill. It is hard to shake the idea, it's the way she writes, that here is Noddy, rattling into Toyland with grumpy old Big Ears in the passenger seat, rather than Enid crying with delight at her first glimpse of Corfe Castle, and Hugh, hands tight on the wheel, his mind already drifting towards the first strong drink of the day in the lounge bar of the Castle Inn. The castle hasn't changed much since. Excitingly, the jackdaws that Enid wrote about are still here, dozens of them, puffing up their grey-black feathers and asserting noisy ownership over the ruined battlements. On the day I visit and sit where Enid once sat, on the soft grass that now covers the old moat, I find their bright blank gaze disturbing. They stand too close, watching all the time, and seem to be choosing which part of my flesh they'd like to snag with their sharp beaks. But Enid loved them. "Chack!" they cried. "Chack! Chack!" as she wrote in her letter to the young readers of Teacher's World. And then, in the very first of the famous 5 books, 5 on a Treasure Island, here they are again, swarming all over the ruined castle on Kirin Island. Chack! 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 With Timmy the dog leaping into the air and snapping at their cowardly hides. Everyone is convinced that Corfe Castle was the model for Kirin Castle, but Enid would never say, and when I ask the taxi driver if it is true, he's a local man, brought up in Corfe, speeding me through the village on the road from Wareham Station to Swanage, his answer is a succinct and scornful no. It is possible he just doesn't want to talk about Enid Blyton. If you only have the output of the BBC to go on, or the memoirs of her second daughter, Imogen, then you are going to be under the impression that Enid was a dysfunctional narcissist, a cold-hearted snob, a racist, and the worst of mothers, who preferred the company of children she'd never met to the grating shrieks and demands of her own. Perhaps the people of Corfe have had enough of the association. Until recently there was a Blyton-themed shop in the village called Ginger Pop, but the owner closed it down because the guardians of Enid Blyton's copyright were traducing her memory with a load of overpriced spin-offs and politically correct rewrites. At least that's how she saw it. She was also irritated by tight-fisted browsers who told her what a lovely shop she was running, but then wandered out without buying anything. There was also, apparently, a spot of bother about some gollywogs in the window. Anyway, my taxi driver is much more interested in talking about the second homes that are sucking the life out of the village. Enid Blyton never owned a house here, although in 1956 she did buy a farmhouse in North Dorset. She didn't live there. It was rented and used as a working farm, but she did set her 18th famous 5 book, 5 on Finniston Farm, in its ancient and mysterious passageways. In 1940, Enid had decided to take a room with her 2 young girls at the Old Ship Inn in Swanage. The place was hit by a Luftwaffe bomb later in the war, after which she tried the marine villas on the front, and then, as her fame and fortune blossomed, she moved on to the Grosvenor Hotel, since demolished, mercifully. It looked as ugly as a burst spleen. When she tired of the Grosvenor's pretensions, she tried the Grand on the east side of town, which is where I'm heading. The taxi driver has moved on to the topic of crime. He says there is none, or nothing worth mentioning, and that the people of Purbeck just step out of their homes, leaving their front doors unlocked without a backward glance. This is also just about the first thing the late-night barman tells me when I arrive at the Grand. "I moved here from Kilburn, and it's nothing like that. It's more like you're living in the 1950s or 60s. No one ever locks their doors." And again with the 2 other taxi drivers I meet on the Isle of Purbeck. Leicester, 1960s. Huddersfield, 1950s. Never locked my front door, ever. I can only hope that there are no burglars reading.